Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Toxic Masculinity, Netflix's Adolescence and its Real Ideology. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? Well, hi everybody, and just to forewarn you, one of my eyes has been affected by hay fever, so I'm not getting emotional or angry. It is what it is, so apologies if it looks like I've been drinking all night, which I assure you I haven't. So this is what we're looking at, and talk about a rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem, but the theme of this talk is going to be, I hope, I'm going to be able to convince you that if you found this viral success of Adolescence a good drama and you enjoyed it, I'm going to try and retrospectively disabuse you of your opinion and argue it's accidentally brilliant, is how I'd phrase it, because I think it embodies everything that's wrong with contemporary culture, while simultaneously presenting everything that's wrong in the mode of its own expression and then becoming popular on the back of it, which sounds a bit convoluted, but I'll explain it as I go along. But I think this is a brilliant publicity still. You talk about the evil eye, and it encapsulates the young boy and the ambivalent quality of evil and innocence, and he's at this key hinge point in his development where he's changing from a child to an adult, and you see both simultaneously in his performance. But what I'm actually looking at more is not so much, in this video at least, the character, the boy Jamie. I'm looking more at his father Eddie, and I'm going to look at, hopefully, as we go along in future, more videos on the concept of masculinity as it's portrayed in various artistic forms. And this struck me as an obvious classic. I think it was 1980. Robert De Niro plays the part of the real-life boxer Jake LaMotta. And to say he had a colourful life, Jake LaMotta would be an understatement. And if you want an example of genuine toxic masculinity, then that's what it would be about. But I think that's not what we're getting in the series Adolescence. I'd argue that's what we're getting. I find it a weird portrayal of Eddie the father's character. And one thing I always think it's important to get your own potential biases out in the open. So if you know someone's starting point, you can make allowances for their interpretation and work out how it chimes or doesn't chime with your own. And to channel Douglas Murray, I am a little bit of an expert on this one, in the sense that I'm from the same area of the world as Stephen Graham, the real-life actor. So I was born and bred in Liverpool, and he is from Kirby, which is an area to the northeast, very close to Liverpool, and it's basically Liverpool in some sense is one massive suburb, the outskirts of the city. And so Kirby are treated as what's known as scousers, i.e. people who eat scouse, which was an Irish stew that the Irish immigrants in Liverpool ate, hence the name. But what I get the sense, this is what I'm trying to be honest about my own interpretation, I'm not as susceptible. I think when he uses his Scouse accent, So there's one, a little quote stick in my mind. I think he's talking to a policeman at one stage, and he goes, "I don't know you from Adam." He exudes working class authenticity. And I think it'll be one of the themes I'm talking about. He appeals to the great and the good within the media industry because he's a little fig leaf for their absolute lack of knowledge about the genuine working class. And I think he plays up to that, and God bless him and good luck to him. He's obviously made a great career on the back of it. But what I'm trying to say in a cumbersome sort of way is I'm not swayed by the accent washes over me and doesn't really affect me because it's from my background. I think it might disproportionately influence, and this is what I'd be interested to hear in the comments. I think he comes across as incredibly authentic, partly because of the accent. And if you're used to the accent, I think you may be more able to spot some of the acting flaws or some of the overemphasis because you're not distracted by the accent. Anyway, that's pet theory. But running throughout the series, I keep thinking of it as a film, but running throughout the series, they never really say they can't say he's a bad man. And I'll quote from Stephen Graham himself some of the things he said in interviews. They deliberately don't want to make him a bad father. But there's an undercurrent all the way through the series that he has a short temper. As if this, and again, to give my biases, get them out in the open, I have been known to beat up a toaster that defied me. And so the idea of having a temper, and again, it relates to the Liverpool thing. Liverpool has a large Irish immigrant influence, my own family included. And so a short temper is part of the course. So in many Liverpool families, there's this thing where you have a big get-together and you can set your watch to it eventually. There'll be a massive argument. Everyone's having an absolutely amazing time. And then it'll descend into recriminations and arguments. And then eventually everyone goes home happy. But this is throughout the series. He has this anger. So specific examples, I think it's referred to Bryony, the psychiatrist who interviews the son Jamie, asks him about, wasn't there an incident where your father tore down a shed in anger? And Jamie says he thought this was quite funny. And so do I, in the sense that I don't have any problems at all with anger against inanimate objects. And I'll be giving you a specific example very shortly. So, yes, he's an angry man, but this begs the question, and I think it's a theme underlying the whole series, to what extent is a man in today's society allowed to be angry? Are they allowed to express it? In what ways? And I think one of the undercurrents of the series is that actually, no, it's dangerous for men to express their emotions, which then begs the question, what happens when you have a whole generation of men pumped full of testosterone given to us by nature, who don't have outlets for their tempers or their anger? Maybe we can all become Zen-like and Buddhist. It's unlikely. So what are the outlets? And again, another theme of this series is it doesn't provide many answers. I think it does that deliberately. It leaves things hanging. And I don't like neat answers in dramas, so I'm very comfortable with enigmatic, unfinished endings. But that's not the same as deliberately manufacturing and incorporating as part of the series a refusal, a deliberate overlooking of potential issues and presenting them ironically as more complex than they actually are. And I think in this case, the notion of male anger, they overcomplicate it and don't address it. They keep alluding to it, but don't fully address it. And I would refer to this as the ideological wheelbarrow. And what I mean by this is the philosopher Slavoj Žižek uses at the beginning, I think it was a book called Violence, appropriately enough. And he tells us he's full of Eastern European anecdotes and jokes. And I think it's appropriate because another aspect of Liverpool is that they have a reputation, or Liverpudlians, being a bit light-fingered, if I can be diplomatic. So there's a story of a security guard, and he works in a factory, and he suspects a guy leaving the factory each day is stealing something. And he's coming up, the security guard's coming up to retirement, and he keeps, week after week, he sees this guy, but he wheels out an empty wheelbarrow, and he's convinced he's stealing something. So it's finally got to his retirement, his last day at work, and he says to this guy, look, I'm leaving, I won't land you in it, but I know you've been nicking something, you know, what have you been nicking? And the guy says, wheelbarrows. And that's a bit like Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. I think what Adolescence, the Netflix series, gets by people is its absolute moral emptiness, and its lack of content is carried out of the factory. That's what's being stolen past you. You're looking for something more significant, and its emptiness and its refusal to engage with real issues is what sneaks past you. And why this, in a sense, bothers me is that I am just absolutely flummoxed by why it has become, well, maybe I'm answering my own question, I'm heckling myself now, but I was wondering, why did it become so successful, this series? And I think it's just the perfect drama. This is what I mean by accidentally brilliant. It's the perfect drama for its time, because we live in emptied out times. And in contrast to that, I want to refer to this series. This is Mr. Inbetween, the Australian series. I'll give you more images later on. And this is a direct quote. This is a guy called, the character's called Ray Shoesmith. So I can't do the Australian accent, I won't try. But I shouldn't laugh, but he makes violence funny, and I'll talk about that more. I'm not trying to be introduce levity to the notion of, you know, genuine violence. But this is one of the aspects of Mr. Inbetween. He actually treats violence much more seriously than Adolescence does. But Mr. Inbetween is a comedy drama. It's very dark comedy, but it's funny all the way through in a very understated Australian way. And I just love this quote. I wouldn't say I enjoy hitting people, you know. He always says, you know. It's like a verbal tick. If I hit somebody, I generally got a pretty good reason. And he says this in therapy. He's got to go to anger management, and there's a guy who's the embodiment of wokeness, who he constantly butts heads with, metaphorically. And that a lot of the humour stems from that. This Neanderthal type, or is he? This is the point. Throughout the series, he shows various layers, but he has very uncompromising attitudes to violence. He couldn't be less like Eddie from the father figure, well, the father in the Adolescence series. So, to give an overview, I've mentioned the ideological wheelbarrow, and this is my concern as to, as I've said, how did it become so popular? And so many people, and I'll just give you a couple of examples shortly, have interpreted it as an amazing insight into the contemporary condition, and it should actually be a form of guidance for how we should approach topics like violence. And I'm just gobsmacked by that, given all the ideological flaws and the patent manipulation that's apparent in the season. So, in the series. So I just keep repeating this, but I'll be genuinely interested if you're open-minded enough to engage in the comments and just say, if you genuinely really loved the series, this could be a whole cathartic episode for me, as I tell you all the reasons why I found it abysmal, and you can tell me why I'm completely wrong. But and this is what I mean by catharsis, because these are all the things that really annoyed me. And again, that is actual important context. When I viewed the series, I came to it with negative preconceptions. So I'm trying to be self-aware as to why I might have disliked it so much. But one of the negative preconceptions was, in the UK at least, it was treated as a documentary almost. And that bothers me because it goes to one of the key themes of this channel, the importance of literature and fiction and how it helps us understand the world better. Well, if we live in a post-literate society, which I keep arguing, our ability to engage with literary themes and literary methods is lessened. And I think people's inability to see the artistic weaknesses of the Adolescence series and to promote it as almost factual guidance for how we should live our lives or the things we should be concerned about, that strikes me as deeply worrying, that this distinction between fact and fiction is becoming increasingly blurred. And part of that, I'm going to argue, is the media's echo chamber. And I think Stephen Graham, the main actor, the father in Adolescence, is part of the problem. Because another sub-theme of the series is the notion of therapy. So in the final episode, when it's all about the aftermath of the family dealing with the fact their son has murdered someone, they keep they're on the bed, the mother and father, and they keep talking about maybe what they could have done better. And initially they start using therapeutic language because they're in therapy. They're receiving help for the trauma they've undergone. And that is the main tenor of the final episode. It's what could we have done? What interests me is at no point is the notion that, completely unbeknownst to them and not due to any parenting faults, they brought up accidentally an absolute little of a psychopath. And to what extent does the little psychopath have to take responsibility for his own psychopathology? It's almost implicit throughout the whole series that all these things either can't be explained or could be helped with therapy. At no point, and I'll talk about this at the very end, but at no point is there a notion that there is perhaps such a thing as evil. There is perhaps some things that can't be explained, but we don't need to try and therapize them out of existence. They're just intractable parts of human existence, which yet again, I would argue, that's what literature and art deals with. And because we've lost touch with that, what are we left with? Therapy speak. And then I'll be giving you words that Stephen Graham himself spoke about his... So I'm not misrepresenting, I'm actually giving you the words that Stephen Graham has given, his interpretation of why they made the series and what it all means. And he talks at one point about accountability. And I'm going to argue he means accountability in the same sense that the Soviet newspaper Pravda meant the word truth. In other words, everyone's accountable so that nobody can be truly accountable. That's what I think is the ideological wheelbarrow aspect of Adolescence. And then I want to contrast all this, and if there's any enthusiasm with this for this video, I might do another follow-up with reference, because I'd started off, I was looking at The Sopranos. I had loads of examples from The Sopranos, and also Colonel Jessup is a character from A Few Good Men, the film with Jack Nicholson, and a very baby-faced Tom Cruise. And it's always misquoted, but I'll give you the misquote. It's like, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth, is what the Jack Nicholson character says. He's Colonel Jessup. And it's a brilliant example of masculinity confronted by bureaucratic, legalistic, the embodiment in the Tom Cruise character in this exchange they have in a military court. But anyway, the Colonel Jessup, Jack Nicholson character, I would suggest, is another Ray Shoesmith. They're very similar in that they take responsibility for the violence they are committing, and they see it as serving, in some senses, a social good, which in this day and age is heresy. But they give very powerful arguments, what I'm calling the unvarnished truth. So Ray Shoesmith, the character in Mr. Inbetween, I'm suggesting he's saying what the series Adolescence completely shies away from. When is violence necessary? Is there a good sort of violence? What moral code do violent men have? What would society be like if there were no violent men? Or there were less violent men with a moral code, let's put it that way, because there's always going to be violence. And what happens when some violent men who can protect society are no longer allowed to is a really interesting question that goes throughout the series, Mr. Inbetween. And then this video is an introduction, basically, to I want to explore the work of Philip Reith. And I didn't think I could just throw Philip Reith at you without providing some contemporary examples. And he writes about the loss of faith, but not in, I don't want to mean, I'm not going to start banging a tambourine and trying to convert people. I'm an agnostic. But Philip Reith he was an American sociologist writing in the latter part of the 20th century, and he wrote about the third world. He inverted the concept of first, second, and third world. So first world for Philip Reith is a primitive tribal society that has myths, of foundational myths of how that society was created. The second world are like the traditional religions of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism. It's a world of faith. And the third world is the world we're in. And this is how he's reversed the normal concept of first and third world. The third world is what we're in. It's a modern contemporary society, but we've lost our faith. We have no abiding values anymore. So he has this wonderful phrase. The first volume of one of his posthumous collections was called My Life Among the Death Works. And that's how he describes contemporary artworks, as death works, because they're empty. And I'm suggesting that Adolescence fits the Reith characterization as a death work. It's completely morally empty. And in that sense, that's why I'll keep saying it's accidentally brilliant, because it does successfully encapsulate the nature of the times we live in. I can never. This is a popular phrase, I believe. I'm trying to remember who originally said it. It's in the mists of time, but denial is not a river in Africa. And I'm going to quote you. This is the Hollywood Reporter interview, and this is Stephen Graham speaking about his role in Adolescence and his creation of the series. Some people have said it's woke ideology, and they've taken it to an extreme, he adds. It was never about race. It was just meant to be a representation of a normal family that could live on your street. It could be your sister's kids, or, God forbid, your own kid. All of the stuff I was influenced by was social realism. And this is the key phrase I want to pick up on. I don't want to be accused of misrepresenting Stephen Graham. So he talks about being influenced by social realism. And I would like to suggest that it is the least socially realistic depiction of violence in the UK that could be conceived, in the sense that if you look at the sociological data, yes, I'm sure there are outlying incidents where, at the extreme, very unlikely candidates like Jamie in this series, from a middle-class loving family, do something outrageous and horrible and evil and kill someone. But that is not the statistical likelihood. The vast majority of knife crime in the UK, or violence, is not perpetrated by people like Jamie. And I don't want to get into the racial aspects, but I just think it's interesting that Stephen Graham starts off by saying it was never about race. Well, yeah, and that's one of the problems. You haven't dealt with the issue of race honestly. You've avoided it. You've picked an atypical protagonist, which wouldn't be a problem. He's entitled to pick whoever he wants for artistic purposes. But it sits uneasily when he then says, I was influenced by social realism. I think that is deeply disingenuous. And that's why I'm suggesting he's deeply in denial about what he's actually doing, this interface between fact and fiction. So again, I read an article about a young boy stabbing a young girl, and then maybe a couple of months later on the news, there was another young boy who'd stabbed a young girl. And if I'm really honest with you, they hurt my heart. So that's, again, Stephen Graham's own words. And then I just ask you to think of those words in conjunction with the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is a people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. And this is my beef with Stephen Graham. In the guise of doing something good and having heartfelt emotional response to the death of young people, he's actually encouraging a situation that Hannah Arendt identified decades ago as one of the key aspects of a totalitarian society. And Adolescence, the series, the overwhelming, as in totalitarian, the overwhelming total response to the series was it was brilliant. We need more of this. We need to discuss these issues. And for all the reasons I'm going to develop, it is not socially realistic, it's ideologically manipulative, and it blurs the distinction between fact and fiction. And that's not my opinion. In the British Parliament, the Prime Minister, it was a slip of the tongue, but as Freud would say, there are no real slips of the tongue. There are no real accidents. He referred to it as a documentary. And I'll give you a picture in a second about a BBC interview where they also, the slip of the tongue, inverted commas, referred to the Adolescence series as a documentary. And it was Labour Party have proposed that it's shown for free in schools as part of an educational project. So this blurring of fact and fiction, it's not my interpretation, it's actually happening in the UK. And then this was, I'm just picking this, this is a relatively random example. This is an American sophomore student, college student, and she wrote an article about adolescence. So I wanted to give it just, and it's just simply one example, but obviously can't give all of them. But I thought what I'm calling the party line in a totalitarian society, there is an accepted party line. And I think this young woman encapsulates that perfectly. Adolescence is more than just a series, it's a case study, and there are countless real stories just like it. No one should have to pay the consequences for boys who aren't taught to handle their emotions. Well, firstly, it's not a case study, it's a drama. There aren't countless real stories just like it. It's an outlier, as I could walk people through, and there's better people than me, social scientists, who could walk you through what an outlier this particular dramatic case is. But she's arguing that it's a case study when it's diametrically opposed to being a case study. No one should have to pay the consequences for boys who aren't taught to handle their emotions. True, I'd give her that much. But then the question is, well, how are they taught to handle their emotions? And how do angry young boys and men, in my case, what happens when you're taught to suppress your emotions because it's not good to be angry? You don't have to be a card-carrying Freudian to realise if you repress things, the return of the repressed, it comes out elsewhere. And it's alluded to in the Adolescence series that his father tried to get him to play football. He took him to boxing. He was trying to find outlets for him. And you could say, well, that's not fair because, or in Liverpudlian accent, that's not fair. You could say it's not fair because he was more artistic. His mother and father in the last episode talk about him drawing things, spending hours drawing in the kitchen, but then he just stopped and he wouldn't do it anymore. But they never stopped him drawing. They were all for him finding an outlet. But he was the one who spent all this time in his bedroom, and you could argue his parents shouldn't have let him spend so much time in his bedroom. But he was the one who didn't have an outlet for his emotions. And that's what the series addresses. But it addresses it while simultaneously implying, well, it was wrong to try and make him play sports, which may or may not be true, but it's a pretty obvious point that sports help young testosterone-driven men to expend some of that energy. If not sport, just basic exercise, which increasingly young people don't get. So the traditional aspects of masculinity, to be strong, to do physical activity, they're being subtly denigrated, whilst simultaneously the program or the series wonders why some young boy could suddenly explode with ridiculous levels of anger. But just to carry on with this idea of fact versus fiction, the black lady is Kemi Badenoch, who's the opposition leader in the UK. And the other woman is a BBC, Naga Munchetti. She's a BBC journalist. And actually, in this particular interview, there was a man with her. I couldn't find a photo of them all together. And both the man and Naga Munchetti, it's ridiculous. They keep asking Kemi Badenoch, have you watched Adolescence? And she says no, because she was resistant just to watching it because everyone else was. And they berate her, and Naga Munchetti actually refers to it as a documentary. Again, this slip of the tongue. And Kemi Badenoch's response is, well, it's not true. And I speak to real people all the time. And I go and speak to the victims of knife crime. I speak to teachers all the time. Why do I need... And they were morally offended she hadn't watched this series. And I just find, again, to go back to Hannah Arendt, this inability to distinguish between fact and fiction is an aspect of totalitarian societies that is quite disturbing. And, the BBC, well... I'll quickly move on if you want to talk about totalitarian organisations. But anyway, so this idea about, on a lighter note, outlets for male anger. I encourage you, I'll put a link in the description, but this is from an old 70s British TV series, Fawlty Towers. And I laugh just thinking about it because I mentioned I've physically abused a toaster in the past. I'll rephrase that. I have violently hit a toaster for disobeying me. And in this instance, he's got some gourmet evening at his hotel. He's a very angry, I wonder why I like him, a very angry hotelier in the British, very middle-class seaside town of Torquay. And they only made, I think, around about 12 episodes. But Fawlty Towers, if you can check it out in some format or another, please do. But in this particular instance, his car's broken down. And he starts saying, I think at one point he says, "You vicious bastard. I've had enough. No more. I'm going to whip you." And he actually proceeds to go and get a branch, and he whips the car. And I just find it's just genuinely funny. But it's also, to be more serious, it's an example of what Aristotle referred to in his Poetics, the concept of catharsis. He gets it out of his system. He doesn't let the frustration with his car rancor and fester. And unless you believe cars are sentient beings, No human being was harmed in this action. But I think there is a strong current in our society where this outrage of a man being angry, it's just not socially acceptable anymore. To the point that this is, in modern times, this is the corner of the street. And notice they've put bollards to stop, I'm guessing. It's a bit like Abbey Road, you know, the zebra crossing that everyone constantly crosses. But so people can't reenact. You'd have maniacs like me whipping cars in homage to Basil Fawlty. But I just think it's an interesting sign of our times that it literally can no longer happen because there are bollards stopping it happening. And I found this that I just thought was a beautiful encapsulation of, I would argue, a healthy aspect of male anger. But then I want to develop the Liverpool theme. So it might, forgive me if this comes across as a bit of a tangent, but Stephen Graham from Adolescence, he plays to his Liverpudlian background. And this is in a street very near to Liverpool Football Club's home ground, Anfield. And recently, it's another example of how male anger isn't allowed. So I don't want to bore you with the full details, but this is one of our players who is leaving the club. And it's complicated because he ran down his contract so we couldn't get a fee for him. And there's all these extra issues. But in the penultimate game of the season, this player was booed. And I estimate 2/3, 3/4 of the crowd, and some people clapped him. And there was a huge outcry from people who weren't Liverpool fans and, in my opinion, shouldn't have anything to say about the issue. None of their business. But the fans in the ground who booed him were criticised roundly. But I just want to point out, in amongst all the complexity of the issue, I'm not claiming I'm right. I would have been throwing rotten eggs at him. And I'm not saying that would have been the right response. But one of the aspects, I think it's always important to try and quote people's own words. This is on the mural. And this is how embedded these characters are in Liverpool culture. But he says, I'm just a normal lad from Liverpool whose dream has just come true. And he said he wanted to be Liverpool captain in future. He was the vice captain. So he set himself up as this local character. And yet he's then turned his back. And again, without going into the minutiae, what I find interesting is people like me and many others at the ground were incensed at him. And in the last game of the season, I was really annoyed. Because of some of the kickback, everyone was very polite to him and clapped him. I'd have been the one person booing still. Because it's this tribal aspect of Liverpool life, which was interesting because I think I don't live in the city anymore, and I thought I was quite divorced from the culture. But it's interesting, you can take the boy out of Liverpool, but my anger towards him is still there. And that's what's not allowed. And Liverpool's an interesting case because, like I say, Stephen Graham uses his Liverpool accent, and that's what gives him working class authenticity in the role. He wants to be a better father than his father was. But in Liverpool, there is this, it's a fascinating city because there's humour and darkness, and this is why I think it relates to the Mr. Inbetween, the Ray Shoesmith character. So, for example, out not far from here, I used to go to the match with my father, who'd park the car a few hundred yards from where this is. And you'd have little feral kids. I used to think of them as meerkats. Local Liverpudlian kids who'd say, "Mind your car, mister." And the idea is if you don't, when you get back, you have to give them a quid or two at the time. Now, God knows how much you'd have to give them. But if you don't, the implication is your car's going to get scratched. And I remember an anecdote where one guy had his van with him, and there's a glass window, and there's a Rottweiler in there, and the kid goes to the bloke, "Can I mind your car, mister?" And he goes, "Don't need to. look at that. And there's this Rottweiler slavering in the back. And quick as a flash, the kid goes, "Does it put fires out, mister?" And that's A, the humour, but B, the implicit violence. And that's the undercurrent of Liverpool culture. And this Trent Alexander-Arnold instance, it was that, I just think it's being decaffeinated. That ability to be angry and express yourself in a crowd of people, to be told that you can't boo at a football match, is a sign, like I say, of what decaffeinated times we live in. And this was during the actual match where he was being booed, and he thought he could go off into the sunset. He's joined Real Madrid, a Spanish club, and everyone would thank him for being a wonderful servant, despite the fact he'd been paid millions for being a servant. And I just love this photo because he's thinking, oh dear, didn't quite get away with that one, did I? And unfortunately he did, because like I say, in the last game, everyone was very polite to him. Ho-hum. But this phrase, was it from Hillary Clinton? It takes a village. And I've added the word idiot, because this is Stephen Graham. Graham and co-writer Jack Thorne pose a question all parents would be horrified to have to answer. What if your child's burgeoning worldview is manipulated? Excuse me. What if your child's burgeoning worldview is manipulated by online creators you can't police, turning an otherwise ordinary youngster into one capable of carrying out a heinous act of violence? This is an examination of male rage, of boy rage, Thorne tells The Hollywood Reporter. It takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a village to destroy a child. Adolescence looks at the different huts that took Jamie down, and the people that could have saved him. So I'll develop this point, but the idea is that everyone's responsible. So I did mention earlier on that no point here is the question to what extent is Jamie responsible. Yes, he's an adolescent. Yes, his brain is still forming. But is he capable of any moral responsibility? It takes a village to destroy a child. Again, the undercurrent of the series is, even though he had a stable, loving family, and that, to talk about the demographics of knife crime and violence and life success of children in general, coming from a two-parent loving family would be your biggest insurance. So Jack Thorne here is presenting in the series, they're downplaying or questioning the role of a solid family unit, when actually that is your biggest protection. So it takes a village to destroy a child. It takes media lovies who are misrepresenting social reality whilst claiming they're influenced by social realism. They help to take down the huts of a stable family, Jack. I won't develop this point, but it did strike me, again, I'd be interested in the comments, but I was just deeply unimpressed. Everyone was saying what an amazing actor the kid was. I thought he was acting. He didn't for any minute strike me as someone who was being natural, despite the one take issue, which maybe I'll talk about, too much to say, but the one take issue people have made quite a lot about. But this is the angry young man who flits, and this is, again, it's what the series does. It alludes to things, it implies things, but it never tackles anything head on. He can be very childlike and needy, but he can also have these absolute outbursts of anger. And to the extent that any reason for this is provided, it's the amorphous, ambiguous Andrew Tate type manipulators, and Jack Thorne in the previous quote is referring to this. These nebulous, it's almost like a conspiracy theory, these nebulous people out there can brainwash your children. When ironically, I'm arguing most of the brainwashing going on are directors like Jack Thorne. So this is back to Stephen Graham. It's just being mindful of the fact not only we parent our children and not only the school educates our children, but also there's influences that we have no idea that are having a profound effects on our young culture. Profound effects, positive and extremely negative. So it's having a look at that and seeing that we're all accountable. And I referred earlier to this idea that we're all accountable is the Pravda notion of truth. It's the, by saying we're all accountable, it's a get out of jail free card for never actually having to deal with what genuine accountability looks like. So the example I always use is if an organization you're working in keeps referring to the notion of excellence, you can be pretty damn sure that they're not genuinely interested in excellence of customer experience, whatever. They're just using the word as a fig leaf for actually having to do something about it. We're trying to present a portrait of complexity of this kid that has been made by all sorts of different influences. And the thing about incel culture is there's a logic to it. And I found that interesting because it's almost like some type of projection. Stephen Graham and Jack Thorne have latched on to the notion of incel culture because they're arguing there's a logic to it. They're implicitly admitting, this is what I mean by the series being accidentally brilliant. They're implicitly admitting that there isn't a logic to the rest of society. And notice in the series, I've mentioned family isn't put up as a bulwark against these influences. Religion is never mentioned. I can't think of an institution, a social institution of any type, religious or secular, that is presented in the series as providing some type of defence. So this bogeyman of incel culture is put up and everyone's defenceless against it. So the parents, just to emphasise, they're always together, they're always present a joint front. They're there for each other. But it's not enough. So this is just from a teacher wrote an article, so I'm trying to provide counter arguments to the the vindictive, cynical attitudes I'm giving you. So a few topics instantaneously trigger a change in Jamie's candor. I apologise for the American spelling. It was an American article. Philistine spelling. Being asked about his father, what being a man feels like, whether or not he likes sports and his interest in girls, instantly set him off. His voice gets aggressive. He replies on the defence. And as any teacher can tell you, it's all a facade. Children have to be taught emotional regulation, and they struggle to hide how they're feeling, even when they think they're pulling a fast one, until they've learned. The problem is that emotions have been gendered and categorised. Boys are told to man up, and that any sign of sadness or fear is the same as showing weakness. So they learn to channel emotions of sorrow and fear into anger. So this is therapy speak. But I repeat, at no point in this type of argument, I've read lots of these type of articles, at no point is there any treatment of the consequence of young men, young boys, not being able to find a way to express their anger. So it's talking about channeling emotions of sorrow and fear into anger, but there's no talk about how do you channel anger. Go and do flower arranging to give a gendered and categorised cynical response. And I think I didn't like, this will be a shock, I didn't like the series, but insofar as, which episode, The third episode was, I think, the most interesting. But even in this, it was interesting because Bryony here, the psychiatrist, was not... Her role was not to explore why... This is my interpretation of why he... From what she seemed to say. Her role is a legal role at this point. She's trying to give an assessment of whether he understands what he's done. She's not there to necessarily explore in a therapeutic encounter why he did what he did. But this is despite the fact the directors in various interviews have said that Adolescence, the series, is a why done it, not a who done it. But again, I think that's blowing smoke, because they don't give a serious treatment of why. They avoid looking at the causes while simultaneously pretending that they are. And I think it's embodied in this psychiatrist encounter, where it's not her actual role to find out the why. It's a much more limited remit. Find out whether he understands. And I think at one point, which shows the cleverness of Jamie, he talks about, you're here to understand what I understand. Is that your understanding? He makes some repetition of the word understanding in a convoluted way. And then, having done something like that to show that he is a bright, sharp kid, he'll have this emotionally incontinent outrage that he can't control. And he comes across clenched fists, threatening. And notice lurking in the background is one of the young offender officers, who's a big bloke. Which I think is interesting in the dynamic where it's the female psychiatrist, the contrast between an angry young man and the female calmness and empathy. But the unquestioned lurking in the background, you need a man capable of violence in case all this goes wrong. So, what is the ideology of adolescence, which I think is deeply manipulative? Well, in myth that I've looked at on this channel, the whole realm of myth, so in Philip Reef's terms, the first world, myth's all about the existential grind that, guess what? Excuse me. Life is tough. Life doesn't seem to have a reason. The gods are capricious. Think of Sisyphus. His punishment: roll the rock up the hill, and then it just rolls right back down again. And I did a video on Albert Camus and his interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus, and he argues what you need to do is find some type of enjoyment in getting the rock to the top before you have to do it all over again. There's Tantalus, isn't there, who's permanently within reach of a bunch of grapes or water, and it permanently recedes from him. So myth deals with life is tough. But ideology is the false... One way of... There are many ways to define the concept of ideology. One of my favourites is Roland Barthes, where he talks about what goes without saying. But the falsely simple. My beef with Adolescence is it presents... It's weird because it presents everything as really being really complicated in a falsely simple way. And I'd argue there are aspects of knife crime, for example, that are relatively simple to understand. Changing them might be complicated. But the root causes, so the breakdown of families, the rise of absent fathers, poverty, which goes along with the breakdown of a two-parent family, single parents have less money, that's an economic fact. So all these things you could talk about. But that's not what Adolescence does. It makes everything falsely simple in the sense that there are these, as I've mentioned, amorphous people in the background, Andrew Tate type figures. But it won't deal with some of the actual causes that could be considered or dealt with. So this relates to the idea of the falsely simple ideology. It's the idea of projective identification. We, or the viewer, you're led to identify with what you're seeing. I think this goes to why it's being confused as a piece of fact rather than fiction. The projective identification is emphasized by the technique they used of the one shot. And maybe in future I'll talk about that, because Alfred Hitchcock in 1948, Rope, he technically couldn't do a one-shot film because the technology didn't allow it, but he did as close as you could achieve it. So it's not, the concept's old, but it made quite an impact, perhaps because we live in such swipe screen times that being asked to concentrate for a whole hour in one take was a shock to some people's systems. But that encouraged this identification with what you were seeing, which interests me because the ancient Greeks, this is Nietzsche's point about the birth of tragedy, the ancient Greeks were doing this millennia ago. And we don't do that now. They also did more than what Adolescence does, because the Greeks weren't afraid to confront the causes of tragedy, whether it's hubris, pride, or, like I've said before, the capricious nature of the gods. Whereas Adolescence shies away, and it just uses the projective identification as its raison d'etre. And everything's ultimately, the message of the series seems to be que sera, sera. It's uncontrollable, there's nothing we can do, which I just think is a cop-out. So, because why it's a cop-out is certain issues are overlooked. So one of the ironies is the discipline. The Stephen Graham Eddie character, he's determined not to be too strict because his father physically beat him. The irony is, he was physically beaten but turned into a good father. His son wasn't physically beaten and turned into a psychopath. So what role? Obviously beating 9 bells out of your children isn't good. But maybe, again, this is why it's an accidentally brilliant series. If you look closely enough, maybe not disciplining your children has even worse consequences. It is mentioned in the, when Bryony, the psychiatrist, interviews him. I keep saying psychiatrist, I don't know if she's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but you get the point, mental health worker. She actually asks him, I think, is it, you've got an Instagram account, why? And he goes, because I want to see what people are posting. And then she says, well, why didn't you just do that rather than post yourself? And he didn't almost seem to think that was an option. And I've heard so many parents, I've read about parents saying their children being bullied online, and idiot me thinks, well, take them offline. Well, can't do that. Well, bit of a circularity involved here. You're decrying the environment in which they're being bullied mercilessly, but apparently they can't live their lives without being in that mercilessly bullying environment. It's a topic for another occasion, but I honestly don't understand it. People are, I think it's the ideology of adolescence. These things are uncontrollable and we can't control them, which is a myth. We choose not to under the guise that it's unrealistic not to, and that's a whole separate argument. We could if we wanted to, we don't want to, but we're not acknowledging the degree to which we don't want to, rather than we can't. I've mentioned the functional families thing. So I think if I had one single beef, even dysfunctional families have better social outcomes for kids than non-intact families. I have various catty things I could say about the current British Prime Minister's family and interesting shape of his family. So I'm going to quickly move on. The whole, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because it is a huge can of worms, but I do find it, for those non-UK viewers, I think you will have heard about the grooming gang scandal. So you have a British Prime Minister in Parliament saying that everyone should watch Adolescence, the series, because it deals with the topic of violence and the biggest threats to young people, while simultaneously not being so keen and actively stopping a national investigation into real, actual, historical and ongoing violence committed against young women in the UK. And that Stephen Graham's also part of that cultural amnesia. There is real toxic masculinity of a type that is not discussed in the UK by the media elites. And I think, again, that was an undercurrent that made me approach the series, knowing that it made me approach the series in a very unforgiving fashion, which has maybe given me a completely jaundiced interpretation. But I just think it's an obvious elephant in the living room that Stephen Graham, despite claiming to be hugely influenced by social realism, there's certain social realities that Stephen Graham will not address. So if he ever made a drama, a sequel to Adolescence based upon the grooming gang scandal, I would apologise profusely, but I don't think I'm ever going to get the chance to apologise to him, unfortunately. And I think that tells its own story. But this idea of post-literate, post-physical society, I've mentioned the lack of physical outlets that Jamie seemed to have or choose not to take. But this idea, I've argued throughout the channel that we live in a post-literate society. And I mentioned Aristotle's Poetics, the notion of catharsis. Nietzsche talks about, I keep mentioning the birth of tragedy, but what Greek tragedy gave us is a way of, a powerful cathartic way of dealing with powerful emotions. And in a post-literate society, the only outlets for that type of art is increasingly series like Adolescence, which aren't cathartic because they don't provide any answers or deal with genuine causes. So you're left unsatisfied, you're left without catharsis, which is a whole complex area, which I think is partly addressed by this quote. What art makes us see and therefore gives to us in the form of seeing, perceiving and feeling, which is not the form of knowing, so a distinction between fact and fiction, is the ideology from which it is born, in which it bathes, from which it detaches itself as art, and which it eludes. So this is my problem with the whole wheelbarrow ideology of Adolescence. According to Louis Althusser, who wrote some brilliant works about the concept of ideology, the French theorist, art reflects upon its own foundational assumptions. It reflects upon its own implicit ideology. You can't, it's very difficult to engage with art without realizing it is art. And that should make you reflect upon, almost as a matter of course, the difference between fact and fiction. So you look at a great Impressionist painting, you're automatically forced to consider the difference between an impression of reality and reality itself. You're forced to consider, the example I've given in a previous video is Monet, the grain stacks in winter. And when I saw it at the Scottish National Gallery, I was forced to consider, how on earth does he get winter sunlight that isn't there because it's a canvas and he's used paint, oil paint? How on earth does he get that quality of light to hit me in my eyes? It's amazing. But you're forced to confront, you're not looking at a real thing. Whereas, just to repeat yet again, Adolescence, the series, was presented for some people, or was perceived by some people, to use this notion of perceiving and seeing and feeling. It was seen, perceived and felt by the great and the good and huge swathes of the population as a factual thing rather than a drama. And I think that is dangerous. And part of the explanation is this Marshall McLuhan quote I'm very fond of. One thing about which fish know exactly nothing is water, since they have no anti-environment which would enable them to perceive the element they live in. I fear that's where we've got to with online and the streaming services. People cannot increasingly realise or are not skilled at thinking about what Althusser is talking about, what should make us reflect upon. There was very little of Althusserian reflection upon the nature of adolescence by the people who thought Adolescence, the series, was wonderful, to the point they saw it as factual, or a case study to refer back. So I'll wrap this up by leading into the whole, what's his name? Ray Shoesmith, the Mr. Inbetween. But just to do that, this idea of faith is from Soren Kierkegaard, faith is the contradiction between the infinite passion of inwardness and objective uncertainty. So I'd suggest it's a quote that I haven't used, but it's in the thumbnail. The idea that, do you like me? Even a little bit. That plaintive cry from Jamie to the Bryony. Excuse me. There's no inwardness. Kierkegaard wrote about the death of inwardness. It's lacking. And I think, again, accidentally, the Adolescence series shows that. And then Philip Reeve, Soren Kierkegaard said more than a century ago that all inwardness is lost. The therapeutic is that terrible beast who has been slouching toward Bethlehem. And that goes to the segue I made at the beginning between the W.B. Yeats poem and that really powerful still from Adolescence. The poem The Second Coming and the still. And again, words from Stephen Graham, the lack of meaning. We wanted him to come from an ordinary family. We wanted to be mindful from the very beginning that there was no way you could point the finger. Dad wasn't particularly violent in the house and didn't raise his hand to mum or the boy or his daughter. Mum wasn't alcoholic. Jamie wasn't abused sexually or mentally or physically. They are a loving family. Why does Jamie turn out into such a psychopath when the daughter is very empathetic? I think the series is implying it's because young men are uniquely susceptible to online influence. Is that what they're claiming? Because I don't think that's true. Jamie is the one that just becomes this completely alien creature. I think this is a beautiful still that shows the psychological distance. And he looks vulnerable and pathetic. But then he also can look completely manipulative and cheeky. And this issue of childhood and responsibility, this is Ray Shoesmith. And I think this quote's from when he's talking to his girlfriend. And he opens up. I think they're by a fire, and he opens up and he starts crying. But he says, I wasn't looking for trouble as a kid. I felt like I was weak. But I learned there's people in this world. They'll take and take till there's nothing left of you. You've got to fight back, you know. And that's what he certainly does. I love the artwork. This is a publicity still. But Ray Shoesmith is a hitman, ex-army, and that's one of the ideas that's examined in the series. He's interviewed at one point by a journalist under terms of anonymity, and he's talking about, she asks him, does it feel different to kill when you're in the army and as a hitman? And he basically says, no, killing's killing. At least as a hitman, you get paid properly. So there's dark themes. And I'm not suggesting he's a moral arbiter. But even at his darkest and most cynical, the character Ray Shoesmith opens up all the types of questions about male toxicity and male violence that Adolescence just doesn't deal with. And this is another still, but it's beautiful because he has a young daughter, and the unicorn, she's obsessed by unicorns, and it reappears as a leitmotif during the series. And he goes out of his way to indulge the innocence of his daughter, who still believes in unicorns. It's quite a funny little subplot. And that goes to the ambivalence and complexity of male violence. Often, and this is one of Ray Shoesmith's consistent arguments, you need violence sometimes to protect the weak and vulnerable. And to go back to the grooming gang issue, partly those girls weren't protected because the type of protective forces that should be protecting them, either the institutions of the police have completely failed in their duty, or fathers who tried to protect their children at the time were actually punished by the police. It's bizarre, it truly is. But if you watch Mr. Inbetween and ask yourself, would the grooming gang scandal be possible in a world where there were more Ray Shoesmiths, disturbing as he is? The character in no way is the true violence he engages in hidden or papered over. But I think what just makes it a genuinely brilliant series is the way it tackles the violence in a way that our society so seldom does. The way it treats male violence as a potentially much needed aspect of society. It's a very radical idea that's dealt with, A, with brilliant insight, psychological insight, and B, with humour, believe it or not. And he's having this type of discussion. This is his anger management therapy. He's in a circle of other people. You know, hello, my name's Ray, I'm a psychopath. Hello, Ray. But this is the moderator. He's a brilliant actor because he's really annoying. And you can tell Ray just wants to punch his lights out, but obviously can't. And at one point, this is what the moderator says: on behalf of society, I should thank you. Because Ray's given him this speech about how actually when he's violent, it's normally for a good cause, as you saw in the previous quotation a while ago. So this is part of the dialogue. Do you enjoy hitting people? I wouldn't say I enjoy hitting people. You know, if I hit someone, I generally got a pretty good reason. That was in the previous, well, one of the previous slides. And you think you had a good reason. Didn't I just say that? So can you remind me again what that reason was? Well, they were being assholes. He beats up, there's two blokes, he beats up one of them, the other one runs away. I think they knocked over his daughter's ice cream. So he gets his daughter safely out of the situation, then goes back and finds them. The world is full of assholes, Ray. Do you realise that? Yeah, and you know why? Why? Because people let them get away with it. See, if you're in jail, right, and you fucked with somebody, you disrespect somebody, you can end up dead. There's consequences. But out here in the real world, there's no consequences, right? So next time, these two pricks are walking down the street and they start thinking, oh, we might go and fuck with somebody. They're going to think twice about it, which is good for everybody. So in your mind, you've done society a favour. Yeah. And that's what I like about the whole series, is that whether you like Adolescence or not, whether you have seen or will look in future at Mr. Inbetween and like it or not, I just think this is the type of dialogue that's sorely lacking as part of the other side of the argument. And there's a very funny instance. The police come to his house to interview him, to ask him questions, and he keeps saying, "I don't answer questions," until the police, they say, well, that they can't formulate a dialogue with him without asking a question, and he just keeps repeating very politely, "I don't answer questions," which I think is again, it's a way in which in Mr. Inbetween, when he's being deliberately obstructive or obfuscating, it's dealt with head on. He admits it. He does it for laughs. Whereas the obfuscation of his anger management therapist, and the obfuscation I'm arguing is central to Adolescence, isn't admitted to and isn't dealt with honestly. And just to round up now, Philip Reith had this concept of therapeutic terrorism, which is a very powerful statement, but more and more I think it's true. So it's mainly from the top down that the therapeutic and terrorist penetrate modern culture. I expect the two types to merge. Medicine and politics into political medicine, the therapeutic dominant. Cleared for action without interdict. An interdict is like to be forbidden, thou shalt not in the Bible, for example. So cleared for action without interdict. The therapist is our ultimate terrorist. And I'm going to go into Philip Reith in a lot of depth in future, but just to pick out from this, when he says, I expect the two types to merge, medicine and politics, given that he wrote this in 1975, almost 50 years before what happened in lockdown, the pandemic, I think it's incredibly prescient. And it's very refreshing. It's a book about education, where unlike the previous teacher I quoted, Reith sees the therapeutic speak, the therapeutic mentality, as actually terroristic of social values. He doesn't sit on the fence, our Philip, I tell you. And just to give an example, holy terror is fear of oneself, fear of the evil in oneself and in the world. It's also fear of punishment. Without this necessary fear, charisma is not possible. To live without this high fear is to be a terror oneself, a monster. And yet to be monstrous has become our ambition, for it is our ambition to live without fear. All holy terror is gone. The interdicts have no power. This is the real death of God and our own humanity. It's out of sheer terror that charisma develops. We live in terror, but never in holy terror. So I just want to emphasize, this is not about necessarily being religious, but what Reith is talking about is the loss of the sacred in our society, whether it's a sacred belief in the power of literature and art or actual religious belief, but there are sacred values that we no longer have. And I've italicized and emboldened that phrase. To live without this high fear is to be a terror oneself, a monster. So I'm going to be exploring Reith. Like I've said, this is an introduction to some of his ideas. But that emboldened statement there, I think, beautifully encapsulates what Adolescence actually says without, I think, realizing it's saying it. I think Jamie is a monster created by a society that lacks the type of genuine fear and terror that Reith's talking about, because we've lost all hierarchical and sacred values. So this final sentence, we live in terror, but never in holy terror. And I'll just finish on that because I've got one last image of the Stephen Graham Eddie character, which I think really does illustrate this notion of living in terror. This is what toxic masculinity, inverted commas, is reduced to. And I don't think it's any better than traditional forms of masculinity that may need recalibrating. But I don't think Adolescence provides the answers for what to do with masculinity. We live in terror, but never in holy terror. So I'll leave you with one last image. Till the next time, all the very best. Take care.